Picture this. You're sitting in a dusty history class, the air thick with the smell of old books and disinterest. The teacher's voice cuts through the haze, dropping what seems like a mind-blowing fact, a nugget of historical trivia designed to shock you awake. Medieval people, they say with theatrical gravity, used expensive spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves to cover up the taste of rotten meat. It's one of those jarring, grotesque facts that makes you go, wow, people back then were really something else. It paints a picture of a desperate, grimy world, a constant battle against spoilage and sickness, where a mouthful of spice could mean the difference between a full belly and a fatal bout of food poisoning. But here's the thing. The single most important thing you need to know today is that it's completely wrong. This myth, this tantalizingly disgusting slice of false history, has been floating around for decades, repeated with authority in classrooms, documentaries, and even some lazy history books. It's become so ingrained in our collective understanding of medieval life that nobody stops to question it. It feels true because it confirms our deepest, most unexamined bias, that the past was a more primitive, stupid, and filthy place, and that we, in our modern brilliance, have ascended from that darkness. But let's engage in a moment of critical thinking, a luxury those Victorian inventors of this myth rarely afforded their subjects. Think about it logically. Would people really spend a fortune, a literal king's ransom, on the most valuable commodities on earth, just to make spoiled, toxic food merely edible? That's not just inefficient. It's economic and culinary insanity. It's like buying a solid gold Rolex to tell time on a broken, waterlogged watch you fished out of a gutter. The very premise collapses under the slightest scrutiny. The truth is, medieval people weren't just surviving day to day, desperately masking the taste of their decay. They were thriving within a sophisticated framework of food culture and preservation techniques, some of which are so effective that they would put our modern, industrialized methods to shame. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but they had preservation methods so nuanced and advanced that they are still used today by high-end artisanal food producers who charge a premium for that old-world quality. In the next few minutes, we're going to tear this rotten myth apart, piece by putrid piece. We'll explore the stunning ingenuity of how people actually preserved their food, creating lasting bounty from seasonal harvests. We'll uncover the true, earth-shattering reason why spices were so valuable that they launched empires and sparked ages of exploration. And we'll expose the bizarre and frankly arrogant reason why this bizarre lie has stuck around for so long. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at a medieval feast, a simple spice rack, or the past itself the same way again. So where did this bizarre, tenacious idea truly take root? Like the most stubborn and pernicious of historical myths, it didn't spring from a complete vacuum, but from a single grain of truth that was then twisted, distorted, and blown so far out of proportion that its original form became utterly unrecognizable. The birth of this falsehood can be traced directly to the stuffy, self-satisfied drawing rooms and lecture halls of the Victorian era. This was a period obsessed with progress, industry, and its own perceived moral and intellectual superiority. Victorian historians, looking back across the centuries at medieval recipe books and household accounts, were confronted with a bewildering and, to their minds, illogical reality. The prolific, almost extravagant use of exotic, powerful spices. They read of dishes laden with pepper, ginger, saffron, and grains of paradise, of sauces so heavily spiced they would overwhelm a modern palate. Instead of engaging with this evidence on its own terms and thinking, hey, maybe these people just had different and perhaps even more adventurous culinary tastes than we do, they jumped to the most wild and condescending of conclusions. Their own cultural biases became a prison for the past. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but these Victorian scholars were products of their time, armed with a rigid, linear view of history that saw their own era as the pinnacle of human achievement. Everything that came before was merely a crude stepping stone, a rehearsal for their own glorious present. They couldn't possibly conceive that medieval nobles and merchants were sophisticated enough to appreciate complex flavors for their own sake, to engage in the pure, joyful decadence of gastronomy. In their worldview, such refinement was a modern invention. Therefore, the only logical explanation, to a Victorian mind, was that these spices must have served a desperate, utilitarian, and grim purpose: to disinfect and disguise. They assumed our ancestors were basically cavemen in fancy clothes, stumbling through a short, brutal life, willing to eat anything that wouldn't immediately kill them, their taste buds constantly assaulted by the ever-present specter of decay. This myth, born from this potent cocktail of arrogance and ignorance, really took flight in the early 20th century. It found a perfect home in the new textbooks being written for a mass education system, seamlessly fitting into the emerging narrative that everything before the modern era, before pasteurization, refrigeration, and germ theory, was inherently primitive, dirty, and dangerous. It was a simple story, easy to teach and easy to remember, a perfect gotcha fact to highlight how far we'd come. Then Hollywood jumped on board, smelling the drama in the squalor. Suddenly, every cinematic depiction of a medieval feast became a grotesque caricature. Great halls thick with smoke and flies, trenchers overflowing with suspiciously gray and glistening meat, and revelers gnawing on giant bones with a reckless abandon that suggested a complete disregard for their own well-being, all while drowning their food in handfuls of spice from oversized, ornate containers. The real kicker, the profound historical irony in all of this, is that these same Victorian and early modern historians who so confidently promoted this myth were the very same people who had access to, and yet conveniently ignored, the extensive and meticulous medieval writings about food safety, market regulation, and preservation. They overlooked countless civic records, guild ordinances, and legal documents that show a society deeply concerned with the quality of its food. Medieval food inspectors, often appointed by the guild or the town council, would routinely patrol markets, their senses sharpened to detect the slightest hint of spoilage. They had the power to condemn entire carcasses, to force butchers to destroy bad meat on the spot, and to impose serious penalties on the offenders. Butchers caught selling putrid meat didn't just get a slap on the wrist. They faced hefty fines that could ruin their business, public humiliation in the stocks where the rotten goods might literally be thrown in their face, and in extreme cases, permanent banishment from their trade and their city walls. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but a stroll through a 14th century London or Paris market was likely a far safer culinary experience than we've been led to believe, governed by rules that were strict, explicit, and brutally enforced. The Victorian mythmakers, in their zeal to paint the past as a perpetual dark age, willfully turned a blind eye to this robust legal framework. But modern archaeology and historiography have dragged it back into the light, thoroughly debunking the rotten meat theory. Yet, like the most resilient strain of bacteria, this piece of intellectual bad meat refuses to go away. It's been repeated by well-meaning teachers, popular authors, and documentary narrators so many times that it has achieved the unshakable status of common knowledge. A classic example of a factoid, something that sounds like a fact but is completely false. If you think this means medieval food preservation was a primitive hit-or-miss affair, a desperate game of chance against inevitable decay, then you are in for a shock that will fundamentally reshape your understanding of the past. These people had preservation down to a science, and I mean that in the most literal sense. It was a field of applied knowledge, tested over centuries, refined through practice, and governed by strict guild protocols. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval communities didn't just hope for the best. They supported entire ecosystems of professional food preservers, salterers, smokers, brewers, bakers, and pickle makers, who were pillars of the local economy. These were not amateurs. They were masters of their craft, men and women who underwent years of apprenticeship, who guarded their trade secrets fiercely, and who passed down their precise techniques through generations, creating a living library of culinary survival. This was a continuous, unbroken chain of expertise that stretched back to antiquity and forward into our modern era. Let's start with meat preservation, since that's the very heart of the myth we are slaying. The most common method, the absolute cornerstone of protein security, was salting. But to imagine this as just roughly throwing some modern table salt on a steak is to commit the same error as the Victorians. It's a catastrophic underestimation of their skill. This was an incredibly precise and nuanced process. They understood that different types of salt, from different sources, had different properties. There was coarse bay salt, harvested from tidal pools, prized for its mineral content and slow-drawing action, perfect for curing large joints of beef and pork for long-term storage. There was finer white salt, more expensive, used for more delicate tasks. The process itself was a ritual. Meat was carefully butchered, rubbed, packed, and layered in barrels with exact quantities of salt, often combined with saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which acted as a fixing agent, giving cured meats their characteristic pink hue and offering additional protection against bacterial growth. The result was a transformation, not just a preservation. A well-salted side of beef or pork could last for over a year. And perhaps the most stunning example of this alchemy was fish. Cod, caught in the teeming waters off Norway and Iceland, was split, heavily salted, and dried on wooden racks called stockfish in the Arctic air, or salt-packed in barrels as saltfish. This preserved cod could last for years. It became lightweight, durable, and immensely valuable. It was the protein that fueled the age of exploration, fed vast armies, and sustained Catholic Europe on its many meatless holy days. It was so crucial it became one of the most important international trade goods of the medieval world, a currency of calories that shaped the economies of nations. This wasn't a technology of desperation. It was a technology of empire. If salting was the steadfast, reliable workhorse of medieval preservation, then smoking was its brilliant artistic partner, a game changer that didn't just save food from rot, but infused it with the very essence of the landscape. Medieval smokehouse operators were far more than simple laborers. They were food preservation artists, alchemists of aroma and flavor, who wielded fire and wood with a nuanced understanding that modern chefs would envy. They knew, through centuries of accumulated, hands-on knowledge, that not all smoke was created equal. Each type of wood released different aromatic compounds and possessed different preservative qualities, and this knowledge was deployed with strategic precision. Dense, slow-burning oak, with its strong, assertive smoke, was the preferred choice for beef, its robust flavor standing up to the powerful infusion. Fruitwoods, like apple or cherry, which burn cleaner and impart a sweeter, milder smoke, were carefully reserved for pork, complementing the rich fat of the animal without overwhelming it. For fish, a lighter wood like beech or alder was often chosen, its gentler smoke preserving the delicate flesh without making it bitter. This wasn't a random process. Each combination of meat and wood was a carefully chosen marriage of flavor and function, a recipe passed down from master to apprentice. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but this ancient sensory science is not lost to history. Walk into any high-end charcuterie producer today, any artisanal smokehouse crafting premium bacon, ham, or smoked salmon, and you are witnessing the direct descendant of these medieval practices. They are using the very same woods, often the very same cold smoking techniques, because 1,000 years of trial and error proved it was the best way to achieve a perfect result. Then there's the really clever stuff, the methods that showcase a breathtaking level of culinary ingenuity. Techniques that prioritize luxury and taste as much as mere survival. Take confit, for example, a method immortalized in the cuisine of southwestern France, but practiced across Europe wherever fat was available. This was the pinnacle of preservation as gastronomy. Duck, goose, or pork would be slowly, gently cooked in its own rendered fat at a low temperature for hours, until the connective tissues broke down and the meat became unbelievably tender. It was then carefully packed into crocks and pots and completely submerged in that same fat, which cooled into a solid, airtight seal, locking out oxygen and bacteria. This created a sterile environment that could preserve the succulent meat for months, even through the winter. But to call it just preservation is to miss the point entirely. This process was a culinary innovation that made the food taste profoundly better. The slow cooking rendered the meat exceptionally tender and flavorful, and the storage in its own fat intensified its richness. It was a way of creating a delicious, ready-to-eat luxury product from a seasonal abundance. Similarly, potting involved cooking meat or fish, mincing it finely, and then sealing it in a pot with a layer of clarified butter on top. This was the ancestor of the modern pâté, a method designed to create a spreadable, flavorful delicacy that could be stored for weeks. These weren't acts of desperation. They were the first steps toward gourmet food production. The medieval table, however, was not solely a carnivorous affair. The preservation of plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, and herbs, was equally vital, a desperate race against the short, brutal window of harvest time to capture summer's bounty for the lean, gray months of winter. Here, too, medieval households displayed a versatile and sophisticated toolkit of methods, turning their kitchens and pantries into laboratories of longevity. Drying was the most obvious and universal technique, a race against moisture that could be won with the help of the sun, the wind, or the gentle heat of a hearth. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung from rafters, their fragrant oils concentrating as their leaves grew brittle. Apples and pears were sliced into rings and strung on lines across the ceiling, their sugars intensifying as they shriveled. Peas, beans, and lentils were simply spread on sheets in the sun or in attics, their life force suspended until they were dropped into a boiling pot months later. But their ingenuity soared far beyond simple dehydration. For the wealthy, and especially within the walled gardens and scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, a sweeter form of alchemy was at work, preserving fruits in honey or in the increasingly available, though still precious, sugar. Monasteries, with their resources, disciplined routines, and need to provide for guests and the sick, became centers of culinary innovation. Monks carefully cooked berries, plums, and quinces with honey, creating thick, sweet conserves that could be stored in barrels. They were developing the first recipes for what we would now recognize as jams, jellies, and fruit preserves, not just as luxuries, but as vital sources of calories and vitamin C during the winter, a way to stave off scurvy and brighten the dark days with a taste of vanished sunshine. Perhaps the most impressive and least celebrated of their methods, however, was their masters of natural refrigeration and controlled atmosphere storage, a quiet, brilliant engineering feat that required no technology beyond an intimate understanding of the earth itself. In northern regions, they would cut great blocks of ice from frozen lakes and rivers during the winter and transport them to specially designed ice houses. These were not just simple holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered structures, often dug deep into a hillside or heavily insulated with straw, peat, or timber, and equipped with drainage channels to carry away meltwater and slow the thaw. With this design, a well-managed ice house could keep its treasure frozen well into the summer months. On a grander scale, some noble estates and monasteries constructed massive underground cellars and larders, or even built entire rooms partially submerged in springs, or designed with clever ventilation shafts that utilized the constant, cool temperature of the earth and the chilling effect of evaporating water to create a natural refrigeration system. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but these structures were the medieval equivalent of walk-in freezers, maintaining a steady, cool humidity that was ideal for storing not just blocks of ice, but barrels of beer, wheels of cheese, baskets of root vegetables, and sides of meat. This wasn't random guesswork. It was applied physics, based on centuries of observed knowledge about thermodynamics, hydrology, and insulation. Each room, each method, had its own specific temperature and humidity requirements tailored to what was being stored. This was a society that didn't fight nature, but listened to it, learned from it, and harnessed its rhythms with a profound and practical intelligence. Let's get real about medieval meat consumption. And by real, I mean addressing the grotesque elephant in the room that this myth has dragged in. Would people, in any era, truly survive, let alone thrive, by routinely eating rotten meat, spiced or not? The answer is a resounding biological no. The pathogens that cause food poisoning, Salmonella, E. coli, botulism, do not care about what century you're in. They do not negotiate. Their effects are brutal, debilitating, and often fatal, and medieval people knew this just as well as we do, not through microscopic science, but through grim, first-hand experience and observable cause and effect. A piece of putrid meat is a toxic bomb, its proteins broken down by bacteria into a cocktail of foul-tasting and downright poisonous compounds like putrescine and cadaverine. No amount of pepper, no heap of costly cinnamon can neutralize these toxins. They would still wreak havoc on the digestive system, leading to violent illness, paralysis, or death. The idea that an entire society would base its diet on such a dangerous practice is not just illogical, it is a profound insult to their basic intelligence and their powerful will to live. Here's something that might truly blow your mind and completely invert the myth. In many ways, medieval people, particularly those in rural communities and smaller towns, often had access to fresher meat than many of us do today in our age of globalized supply chains. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but most medieval communities operated under strict, common-sense rules about when and where animals could be slaughtered. In towns and cities, butchers were not free agents. They were highly regulated members of powerful guilds, and they were required to conduct their work in designated, centralized slaughterhouses or in specific areas just outside the city walls. This was not for mere convenience. It was so that the meat could be inspected immediately by guild masters or city officials before it ever reached a market stall. Think about the logistics for a second and compare it to our modern experience. Most medieval people, even many urban dwellers, lived in much closer proximity to the source of their food. Animals were raised locally, often on common land, in small holdings, or even in urban backyards. When a family needed meat, they didn't go to a sterile supermarket to select a plastic-wrapped, styrofoam-trayed product that had traveled hundreds of miles from a massive industrial processing plant, its origins completely obscured. Instead, they often knew exactly where their meat came from, sometimes from their own yard, sometimes from a neighbor's farm, or from a local butcher who they knew by name and who had a reputation to uphold. The animal was frequently killed to order, or very recently, and the connection between the pasture and the plate was short, visible, and accountable. The butchering process itself was a masterclass in efficiency and respect for the animal. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval butchers were the original pioneers of the nose-to-tail approach, long before it became a trendy restaurant concept. Every single part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted. The prime cuts went to the wealthy tables, yes, but the blood went into black puddings, the offal into pies and sausages. the bones into stocks and glue, the hide into leather, and the fat into tallow for candles and soap. This wasn't just thrift. It was a deeply ingrained philosophy of resourcefulness. Even the poorest people could often get access to nutritious organ meats and other less desirable cuts, ensuring that the community's protein was distributed. When they did have leftover fresh meat, medieval cooks didn't just let it sit on a counter, hoping that a later application of spices would make it edible. They immediately processed it. They transformed it. That leftover pork became a sausage, preserved with salt and herbs and stuffed into its own cleaned intestines. That poultry and game went into a potted paste, sealed under a layer of fat. These weren't just desperate preservation methods. They were deliberate culinary techniques that created new, delicious, and stable foods. It is from these very practices that we inherited the entire glorious tradition of European charcuterie, the salamis, the hams, the pâtés, and the terrines that we now consider gourmet delights. They were born not from poverty of imagination, but from its abundance. And here's the final, undeniable kicker that should shatter the myth into a million pieces. Medieval people were actually remarkably picky and litigious about the quality of their meat. This was not a society that turned a blind eye to spoilage. Market records, court rolls, and civic documents from across Europe are filled with complaints, fines, and public disputes over the sale of substandard food. Customers, from housewives to wealthy stewards shopping for a noble household, would routinely inspect meat at the market with a critical eye, a discerning nose, and a skeptical poke of the finger. They knew the signs of freshness and the stench of decay, and they were not shy about voicing their displeasure. Butchers who tried to pass off old, discolored, or foul-smelling meat faced immediate consequences that went far beyond a simple bad review. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the level of food quality control in some medieval towns was so advanced, so rigorously enforced, that it would genuinely impress, and perhaps shame, some modern health inspectors. In London, the assize of bread and ale, and later more specific meat ordinances, gave officials the power to destroy bad goods on the spot. A butcher caught selling putrid meat could have his entire stock confiscated and burned before his eyes, a devastating financial loss. But the punishment didn't end there. He would face crippling fines, often multiples of the value of the spoiled product. For repeat offenders, the penalties escalated to include public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, where the rotten meat might be literally burned under his nose or even thrown at him by an offended and disgusted public. In extreme cases, a butcher could lose his right to trade altogether, be banished from the city gates, or have his shop closed permanently. His reputation, once tarnished, was almost impossible to recover. This was a culture that understood the direct link between public health and commerce, and it enforced it with a brutal, transparent efficiency. They lacked our scientific vocabulary for bacteria, but they possessed a robust, practical understanding of corruption and its dangers. They knew that bad meat caused disease and social unrest. The guild system itself acted as a powerful self-regulating body. Butchers had a collective interest in maintaining high standards to preserve the reputation of their entire trade and to avoid the heavy hand of city authorities. This intricate web of regulation, self-interest, and public vigilance creates a picture that is the absolute antithesis of the myth. We are not looking at a world of careless decay, but at a highly organized society that was proactively, aggressively, and effectively fighting against it every single day. The fantasy of a lord casually sprinkling priceless pepper onto a rotting haunch of beef isn't just inaccurate. It is an insult to the intricate and sophisticated food safety ecosystem they worked so hard to build and maintain. The very existence of these strict laws proves that selling bad meat was a recognized crime, not a common practice. Now let's pivot to the heart of the matter. The glittering, aromatic core of the entire misconception. What spices truly meant in medieval society, and why the very idea of wasting such treasures on rotten meat is not just wrong, but absolutely, economically, and culturally ridiculous. To understand this, we must first perform a complete mental reset, to strip away our modern reality of a world where pepper is a dusty shaker on a diner table and cinnamon is a cheap staple in every supermarket baking aisle. In the medieval world, spices were not mere seasonings. They were magic, medicine, wealth, and power, all condensed into a dried berry, a knobby root, or a few precious strands of crimson. They were so profoundly valuable that they transcended the category of food and entered the realm of high finance and luxury goods. Imagine spending the equivalent of a brand new car, or even a down payment on a house, on a single kilogram of a seasoning. That is the scale of value we are talking about. This is the crucial, mind-bending economic reality that the rotten meat myth completely ignores. To suggest a medieval cook would use these commodities to mask rot is like suggesting a modern billionaire would use a Picasso painting as a drop cloth for a messy art project. It is an obscene, illogical waste that runs counter to every instinct of acquisition and preservation. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but spices were so liquid and reliable in their value that they were literally used as currency in major transactions. A pound of saffron, the most expensive spice by weight, requiring tens of thousands of hand-harvested crocus blossoms, could indeed buy a strong horse or serve as a knight's ransom. A sack of black pepper, that same humble dust we sprinkle on eggs, was a form of portable wealth, a banknote that could be used to pay a dowry, settle a debt between merchants, or pay a year's rent on a prosperous townhouse. Spices were not stored in kitchens. They were locked in chests alongside silver plate and deeds to land. They were listed in wills and inventories, bequeathed to heirs with the same gravity as a piece of jewelry or a tract of farmland. These weren't just ingredients. They were serious, concentrated wealth. The spice trade didn't just supply kitchens. It shaped global politics and financed empires. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the immense fortunes of the Italian maritime republics, most notably Venice, were built entirely upon their monopolistic control of the spice trade routes from the east. Venetian merchants, dealing through Arab middlemen who themselves guarded the overland routes from India and the Moluccas, the famed Spice Islands, became the gatekeepers of luxury for all of Europe, marking up prices by thousands of % as these goods moved from the Indian Ocean to the tables of French dukes and English kings. This staggering concentration of wealth and power is what ultimately drove the age of exploration. It was the single biggest economic motivator. Prince Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and Christopher Columbus were not setting sail out of a pure, abstract thirst for knowledge. They were funded by crowns and investors desperate to break the Venetian and Arab stranglehold, to find a direct sea route to the source of these spices, and to siphon off that unimaginable wealth for themselves. Columbus wasn't looking for a new world. He was meticulously, desperately calculating a westward route to the spice markets of Cipangu, Japan, and Cathay, China. And he carried samples of spices with him to show the natives what he sought. The fate of continents was altered by the pursuit of pepper and cloves. This is the monumental, world-changing context that our silly little myth about food spoilage is up against. Here, then, is where the myth doesn't just stumble. It collapses into a heap of absurdity. If spices were this phenomenally valuable, literal currency, the cause of wars, and the catalyst for epic-making voyages, then the next logical question is the death blow to the entire fallacy. Who, in this society, could actually afford to use them? The answer is as simple as it is devastating to the myth. Almost no one. And certainly not the people who would have been eating routinely spoiled food. The average medieval peasant, artisan, or even a modestly successful merchant was not seasoning their daily pottage or weeknight roast with imported black pepper, cinnamon, or cloves. For them, flavor came from the garden, the forest, and the field. Pungent garlic and onions pulled from the kitchen plot. Hardy parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme grown by the door. Wild leeks and mushrooms foraged from the woods, and mustard seeds ground with vinegar. These were the flavors of everyday medieval life, vibrant, local, and free. The exotic spices from the East were the exclusive domain of the top sliver of society. The nobility, the high-ranking clergy, and the ultra-wealthy merchant princes. They were a blazingly bright symbol of status, a way to literally consume one's wealth and display it to envious guests at a feast. And those wealthy elites who could afford to build their menus around these precious commodities, what were they eating? They were certainly not eating spoiled meat. The very idea is laughable. These were the people with the most access to the freshest, highest quality ingredients available. They were the ones who could afford to be the most fastidious. A noble household drew its supplies from a vast and controlled network of resources. Fresh game, venison, boar, rabbit, and every manner of fowl, from their private, well-stocked hunting forests and warrens. Freshwater fish, pike, perch, trout, from their own stocked ponds and streams. Saltwater fish, packed in ice and rushed by fast cart from the coast. Their bread was made from the finest, most finely bolted white wheat flour, not the coarse rye and barley of the common man. They had orchards, herb gardens, and dovecotes to supply fresh fruit, greens, and squab. These were not people on the brink of starvation, forced to make hard choices about questionable food. They were at the absolute pinnacle of culinary privilege. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the surviving medieval recipe books from these noble households, like the famous Form of Cury compiled for the court of King Richard II, are not manuals of disaster mitigation. They are catalogs of extravagant, show-stopping spectacle food. They show incredibly sophisticated and complex spice combinations used to create layered, nuanced flavors, not to mask rot. Dishes were perfumed with ginger, galangal, and grains of paradise, sweetened with cinnamon, sugar, and saffron, and sharpened with cubebs and long pepper. They were creating spiced wines like Hippocras and Claret, gilding whole peacocks and swans, and crafting elaborate subtleties, sculpted marzipan, and sugar creations that were as much about theater as taste. This was the height of culinary art, a deliberate and boastful display of wealth and refinement. Using these astronomically expensive ingredients to cover up the taste of cheap, rotten meat would have been the ultimate social and economic perversion, an act of such profound stupidity that it would have been scandalous. The whole rotten meat myth, when held up against the blinding light of this economic and social reality, doesn't just look wrong. It looks utterly insane. So let's pull all these threads together one final time and watch as this myth, already riddled with holes, completely unravels under the weight of its own impossible contradictions. We are asked to believe in a society that supposedly couldn't preserve food properly, yet we have evidence of their multiple, sophisticated, and highly effective preservation techniques: salting, smoking, confit, drying, fermenting, and natural refrigeration. Methods so brilliant we still use them today for our most prized artisanal foods. We are told they routinely ate rotten meat, even though we have extensive records of strict food safety laws, powerful guild regulations, and a consuming public that was highly discerning and litigious about quality, with punishments for offenders that were swift, severe, and publicly humiliating. The myth insists they used precious spices to mask this decay, despite the overwhelming historical fact that these spices were among the most valuable commodities on the planet. Literal units of currency, accessible only to the ultra-wealthy elite who, by virtue of that very wealth, had the best access to the freshest meat, fish, and game imaginable. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the entire logic of the myth is a perfect, self-devouring paradox. It is a house of cards built on a foundation of sand. Let's break it down with the cold, hard logic it never receives. If you were wealthy enough to afford expensive imported spices, you were certainly wealthy enough to afford fresh, high-quality meat. There was no need for the mask because there was nothing to hide. Conversely, if your economic situation was so dire that you were forced to contemplate eating spoiled meat, you absolutely, definitively could not afford the spices required to disguise it. There is no middle ground. There is no scenario, no economic or social niche where this practice makes a shred of sense. It is a historical impossibility. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but we are not theorizing in a vacuum. We have the evidence: hundreds of medieval cookbooks, household account rolls, and merchant ledgers that show us exactly how spices were used. They are meticulously recorded, purchased in small, expensive quantities, and deployed in specific recipes. These documents are not lists of desperate measures. They are blueprints for luxury, for celebration, for showing off. They describe dishes like mortreuse, a rich pounded meat and fish dish delicately spiced with saffron and ginger, or blanc mange, a creamy stew of capon and almonds flavored with sugar and cinnamon. These weren't attempts to make spoiled food edible. They were the medieval equivalent of haute cuisine, designed to impress, delight, and showcase the host's immense wealth and refined taste. The persistence of this silly myth, then, says far more about us than it does about medieval people. It satisfies a deep, unspoken need to feel superior to the past, to see history as a linear march from their primitive suffering to our enlightened, comfortable present. It allows us to look back through the centuries with a condescending chuckle, oblivious to the ingenuity, sophistication, and sheer competence that surrounded us. But the reality is that medieval people were just as clever, resourceful, and discerning as we are. They simply operated with a different set of technologies, priorities, and economic realities. They weren't stumbling through a dirty, short life. They were building, creating, trading, and dining with a skill and passion that we are only now, centuries later, beginning to fully appreciate and rediscover in our own search for authentic, flavorful food. What have we truly learned, then, by dissecting this centuries-old falsehood? The idea that medieval people used spices to mask the taste of rotten meat isn't just a simple error. It's a perfect case study in how historical myths are born, how they spread, and why they are so dangerously effective. They blind us to the true texture of the past, replacing complex, fascinating reality with a simplistic and often derogatory cartoon. These weren't primitive people stumbling through a miserable existence, desperately using precious resources to make their rotten fare edible. They were skilled craftsmen, the salter who knew exactly how to pack a barrel of beef to last a winter's voyage, the smokehouse artist who could tell the perfect cure by the color of the air and the scent of the wood. They were talented preservers, the cooks who transformed seasonal gluts into year-round delights through pickling, potting, and preserving. They were sophisticated traders and merchants who built an entire global economy, financing voyages that would change the world, all on the back of their desire for flavor and luxury. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the medieval food culture was an incredibly complex and finely tuned machine. From the local butcher following strict guild regulations that governed everything from the cleanliness of his block to the pricing of offal, to the spice merchants in Venice and Genoa financing international trade routes that stretched to the very edges of the known world. Every single link in the chain was carefully managed, regulated, and optimized to keep people healthy, well-fed, and connected to a wider world of flavor. It was a system built on respect for the ingredient, for the customer, for the craft, and for the law. Next time you hear someone, whether it's a friend, a documentarian, or even a teacher, repeat this tired old myth, I challenge you to not just accept it. Gently push back. Ask them the simple, logical question that exposes the absurdity. Would you eat rotten meat if someone put some pepper on it? The answer, of course, is a visceral, instinctive no. And neither would anyone else, in any century, regardless of their technology. Our medieval ancestors weren't just surviving in the dark. They were thinking, innovating, and developing preservation techniques so effective and brilliant that we still use them today to create the foods we consider the pinnacle of quality and taste. Their legacy is not one of desperation, but of deliciousness. It's in the smoky depth of a prosciutto, the rich tang of a pickle, the savory depth of a potted confit. They were not our inferiors. They were our teachers. If you've enjoyed this journey into the real and far more interesting past, if you've enjoyed busting this myth and seeing the vibrant, clever world that was hiding behind it, then hit that subscribe button. Because history is filled with these misconceptions waiting to be dismantled, and we've got plenty more to tackle. Drop a comment below sharing the weirdest historical fact you've ever heard. Maybe that will be the one we debunk next.